Hello, everybody. I'm just waiting for the system to start. I think we started. So, good evening. Dobry večer. I hope you can hear me. I hope you can see me. I apologize for the background, but I'm sitting still at home, Corona related. Can you perhaps let us know in the chat box if you can hear me, see me, and where you are from? From what city are you listening in from? That would be much appreciated. And then we continue. The Hague, welcome. So I see sound is perfect. Thank you, Alisa. My name is Jerke Verschoor. I'm the director of the Netherlands Education Support Office in Moscow. And as you know, we bring you this series of lectures, the Dutch Science Talks, and we do this in collaboration with the Netherlands Embassy. This is actually our last talk of this season. We'll be back after the summer, still online, I think, but we do hope to bring offline lectures to Russia again soon. With us today is Professor Ingrid Robijns. She's an economist and philosopher and holds the chair in ethics of institutions at the Ethics Institute at Utrecht University. She did an MSc in economics, an MA in philosophy, and a PhD at Cambridge University with a thesis on gender inequality and the capability approach. Now, her primary areas of expertise are issues of distributive justice, accounts of well-being and human-centered development, and the ethical analysis of social institutions and public policies. Now, what we're going to discuss today is, of course, a little bit known by the title, Carbon Emissions as a Moral Issue. And what is much less discussed in the public arena is that climate change has also this ethical dimension. Now, let's find out what Professor Robijns has to say about this and share with us today. Dear Ingrid, please turn on your video and your sound. And dear attendees, if you have questions, please ask them in the chat. And after the lecture of Professor Robijns, we will ask her the questions. And hello, Ingrid, you are there.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And I can hear and see you, so I will turn on your presentation and turn off my video, and then the floor is yours.
Well, thank you to everybody who's listening for being here on, it's a very sunny day in Utrecht. I hope it is the same in Moscow, St. Petersburg, or from wherever you're watching this. I will talk for the next 45 minutes about climate change and the climate crisis, and especially focusing on greenhouse gas emissions from the perspective of ethics and moral philosophy. And I will try to give you a bit of an overview of the different issues at stake, and especially, I hope, show why this is a moral issue. It's also a technical issue and all the other issues, but it's also a moral issue. And that will be my task to lay out why this is the case. So, climate change. What is exactly going on there? And of course, one could have a presentation by a climate scientist, and they would be able to give you all the details of the different types of greenhouse gas emissions and how they are different and what elements there are in the Earth system, as they call it. I am not a climate scientist or somebody from the geo department. I basically just read what they do, and if I don't understand anything, I ask them for help. I'm trying to understand how climate change and the processes that are involved, what kind of ethical and moral questions they raise. So first, I want to lay out very brief, just in one slide, what I think is the essence of climate change. And it's in the end, as we all know, it's a causal chain. And the first layer, which is on the top of this slide, is that has to do with how we organize our societies, how we organize the economy. So we have, both in Russia, but also in the Netherlands and many other countries, we have what one could call post-industrialized economies. But there are, of course, also areas in the world where you still have subsistence economy or different types of economy. It also depends on what we produce and consume, and also in what way. So those factors, which is basically the lives we live, the material lives we live, determine are one factor determining our emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions. A very simple example, if I have a car that drives on gasoline by using fuel and driving my car, I put emissions in the air which go into the atmosphere. But there are many different ways in which we emit greenhouse gases. There are also different types of greenhouse gases. I have, for the sake of coming up with a catchy title, I've called it here carbon emissions, but of course it should be carbon dioxide emissions, and also different types of greenhouse gas emissions. For example, an important one, I think, for normative discussions is also methane, which is the greenhouse gas that is released in food production, especially in beef production. Um, so we have all these different ways in which, by the way that we live our lives, we release emissions in the air. We can, of course, another factor that determines in the total amount of emissions that we put into the atmosphere is what we do with the ecosystems. So one of the problems we also see that climate scholars are addressing is that on a global scale, we are rapidly turning forests into land that is then used for, say, soy production, which is used to feed cattle. So, and then the change of the land also leads to additional, it's actually a reduction in the capacity of this, a reduction in the capacity of this ecosystem to absorb emissions. If the total net emissions increase, hence the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere increases because the trees and the ecosystems in the ocean can no longer absorb it, then we see the problem we are now facing, which is that because the concentration increases, we have climate change and all the effects that come with it. And that brings me to the last and the third layer of consequences. And that is really where I think all the ethical and normative moral questions are raised. There are consequences. There are consequences for ecosystems. Of course, if you have a tropical wood and you slash it in order to cultivate soy to feed cattle, then that is bad for that tropical wood. But most of the time we are, because we tend to work with anthropocentric views, which is views that put human beings at the center of our evaluation of what we do. We are most of all concerned about what the consequences are for human beings. And there, of course, I'm just going to mention a few, but anybody who reads the newspapers or the blogs or the internet knows of these things. There are rising sea levels, which is, of course, for the Netherlands, a very serious challenge. We also know that change in the atmosphere will lead to an increase in extreme weather events. For example, more fires, which is also something that we have seen in recent years. It's actually, one should put it precisely, the risk of extreme weather events increases, and it's all about probability and risk. And the same with flooding, storms, etc. On the other side, we also see that it leads to more droughts, which for some areas in the world will lead to food and water insecurity. So one of the worries we should have about climate change is that it might lead to famines in areas that, at least for the time being, are relatively protected from famines. So this is potentially, of course, will lead to many people who will die from starvation. And then there are further issues such as diseases that we, for example, in Europe currently do not have, might return, or geopolitical conflicts are also sometimes attributed to climate change. Now, anybody who reads up on this, or if you read the IPCC reports, on balance, these consequences are negative. I mean, there are some positive aspects to mention. For example, people in the Netherlands sometimes say, oh, we can start cultivating more grapes and make our own wine. And there are some other sometimes fancy and sometimes also commercial possibilities. But on balance, climate change is seen as severely dangerous for human beings, but also for animals and ecosystems. So that is basically the starting point. That is, as so far, is not about ethics. This is just kind of a brief summary of what I take to be the consensus among geoscientists about what is happening and what the consequences will be. And now we move to, well, I will give you one example just by way of illustration, and then we move to the ethical analysis. So here's just an example. The small islands in the Pacific. So there are islands such as Tuvalu, which is most discussed in the literature, but also Kiribati, which, for example, it's a whole area of small islands together, 100,000 people. What will happen with the people who live there is that they will just not only lose lands, which they are already losing because the sea is already entering in the island. So the salt water is already contaminating the fresh water. They are losing lands, they are losing livelihoods, but they're even at the verge of losing their nation, in the sense that the whole island is predicted to disappear by the estimates is now around 2030. In the case of Kiribati, they have actually bought parts of Fiji in the hope to, that will of course have to be negotiated, but to see whether you could restore your nation there. But these are of course all very tricky issues. So this also shows how far-reaching the effects could be. Now, why is this the issue of climate change? Why is it an issue of moral concern? And I think the best way to approach this is by looking at what is called the carbon budget. The carbon budget is the total amount of emissions that we are estimated to still be able to make. And if I say we, I mean everybody living on Earth, because this is a global phenomenon. And of course, that budget depends on how much risk we want to take about future increases in decrease. Now, the consensus seems to be that the best would be if we can stick to 1.5 degrees increase in temperature, and that 2 degrees would still be, although it would be worse, it would still be, well, perhaps I can use the word manageable, but the scientists tend to say we have to stay under 2 degrees and preferably 1.5, because if we go to 3 or 4 degrees, they are really predicting very dire consequences. So then you can calculate how many emissions you can still make in order for the climate in the Earth system to lead to a temperature rise of 1.5, respectively 2 degrees. And one thing that I haven't mentioned yet, but that is also important to realize, is that these emissions stay in the atmosphere for a very long time. So scientists tend to disagree a bit about how long, but they speak of hundreds of years, and some would say that a certain percentage of these emissions stay there effectively forever. So that means that it is not an issue like we emit and then we just wait and all the emissions disappear. No, it's really, the problem is that it's an accumulation. So Jacke, could you show us the carbon clock, which will illustrate how much the budget still is? So this is an estimate by scientists from Germany. And we are now looking at what, under the 2 degrees Celsius increase scenario, how many more years we could emit at the level that we're currently doing. So the estimate is that the CO2 budget would be depleted in 24 years. That means that in 24 years, so the lowest line is how many tons budget CO2, well, CO2 of equivalent is it, all the emissions are kind of calculated on one metric. How big would the budget still be? And then given the current pace at which we are emitting, that can be calculated in terms of years and months. So that is 24 years and 5 months. And if we now look at 1.5 degrees, then you see that it's only 6 years and 6 months. So if we want to stay within the safest boundary of temperature rise, then the scientists suggest that we have 6 years and 6 months at the current pace, and then we have used up the entire emissions budget. Thank you, Yahya. It's back. Yeah. Okay, good, great. So this actually shows us the problem. The problem is we are more than 7 billion people on Earth. The estimates is that the entire world population will grow to, depending on what the numbers exactly are, 10, possibly 12 billion people. And we all want to have a share of this emission absorption capacity. We all want to emit because we want to emit because we want to build a house. If we build a house, there are emissions involved, because we want to move around, because we want to just basically eat. All these normal forms of consumption, even basic forms of consumption, require emissions. Under the current technological circumstances and the current way in which we've organized societies, that means that the budget is scarce. Scarce, just the definition of scarcity is that the total amount that is available is less than that what everybody would like to have. So that's the economist definition of scarcity. Hence, what each of us, this raises the question, how much can each of us still take? But that also raises the question, how much have we been taking so far? So, and here, the story I've been telling so far now moves over really into the question of fairness and distributive justice, because the question now is, who is using how many emissions? How does the distribution of greenhouse gas emissions look like? And this is, I show you here data which are from this website, globalcarbonatlas.org. So this is a website that provides estimates or for emissions, very different types. So aggregate emissions, per capita emissions, and so forth. Since I'm especially interested in questions of ethics and morality, the proper thing to look at is emissions per person. Because if you look at some of the graphs you see, for example, that China has really has grown a lot in terms of emissions. But why? Because China is a very big country with around, just off the top of my head, around 1 billion people. But if you look at issues of fairness, then of course, each person has, in principle, an equal claim to make to emissions. At least that should be the default. And then you can argue about why there should be certain exceptions. For example, you could say, well, but some people live in moderately temperatured areas, so they don't need so much heating. But if you live in the north of Russia, actually, you may need more emissions because you need more heating. And those kind of arguments could then weigh in. But what we see in this graph is that, so I'm now going to first talk you through consumption emissions, and then we can quickly say something about territorial emissions. The difference is that consumption emissions are the emissions when we really look at who consumes what. So if I drive my car with gasoline and it doesn't come from, the fuel doesn't come from the Netherlands because we do not have crude oil. So that means that I go to buy the fuel, but the fuel is imported from a country that has oil reserves. That means that some of these countries will be polluting in this or emitting in the sense of in the production side, but actually the consumption is taking place somewhere else. And although one can also argue about this, I think for questions of ethics and fairness, the first thing to look at is consumption emissions. So here we see that the world average of consumption emissions for the latest year for which the data are available is 4.8 tons CO2 equivalent emissions per year. But this column shows us that there are great inequalities between countries. So, for example, North America, which is the USA, Canada, Mexico, and I think those are the ones that are included, has on average 14 ton CO2 equivalent emissions per person per year. And then it goes down. So Europe has almost 8, the Middle East has almost 7, China 6.3. I should say that Russia is included in Europe in this website. And I also checked, and actually the Netherlands and Russia are very close to each other, only 0.1 point difference. So that was not really worth including in the table. But what you see in this table is that, of course, if you go down and you look at India, which is, of course, also a very big country, the average consumption emissions is less than 2 tons. And in Africa, it's even less than 1 ton. So there are huge inequalities between the countries. But of course, this information is already aggregate. So of course, within these countries, there are also, again, major differences. There are some studies done that try to estimate not at the level of country averages, but at the level of individuals. And for example, both India and Brazil have a group of people. They are on average not resource-rich countries in the sense of financially poor countries, but they have a group of people, a group of citizens that are extremely rich, and they tend to have easily emit, say, 150 tons per year per person. And of course, if we look at the globally most rich people, one speaks about thousands of tons per year. What this table also shows is the size of the challenge. So what would be the sustainable level? There was a paper by Lucas Chancel and Thomas Piketty, 2 French economists, who estimated, but they had their own data who were slightly different than the one I present you here, that the sustainable level, if one were to have it over 50 years, would be 1.3 tons. What we know from the scientific consensus is that the policy advice now from the scientists, but also I think the political consensus, is that we should try to aim for a 50% reduction by 2030, and that we should try to get to net zero by 2050. Of course, I haven't actually said anything about net, because one of the elements of net could, of course, also be to have negative emissions, either by taking the emissions from the atmosphere, the carbon and the carbon dioxide, and storing it. That is one possible way in which we could also reduce net emissions. But so this is a technological, I wouldn't say solution, but at least it's a technological measure to reduce the net emissions. But even if we try to think about minus 50% by 2030, 2030 is 18 and a half years from now. And that would mean that if you take the world average, which is now 4.8, if we take half of it, it's 2.4. Imagine that all those countries should reduce their emissions to, on average, 2.4. That's a huge challenge. Because let me just, in order to give you a bit of a sense of what one can currently, under the current circumstances, do with, say, 2.4 tons emissions. And I emphasize the current circumstances because a lot depends on the state of technological development and also on how we have organized societies. Just to give you a few figures to get a sense of what these figures mean for our real lives. there was a study done that was published in the journal Climate Change in 2014 on different types of diet. So how much, if you eat as an average person the whole year, how many emissions do you cause? If one eats vegan, that means no meat products, also no cheese, no butter, no eggs. The emissions, and these were estimates for the United Kingdom, are that you emit around one, just slightly above 1.06 tons CO2 equivalent emissions per person per year. So that is, of course, if you only have, say, 2.4 to spend, that's already a lot. If you're a vegetarian, you're at 1.4. And if you eat on average 100 grams of meat per day, you're at 2.63. So this shows that already by just eating the way we currently do, in the current food production system that we have, we are already emitting between 1 and 2.6 tons carbon emissions per year. Now then think about taking a transatlantic flight. A transatlantic flight currently is easily more than 1 ton. So this just shows how to interpret or weigh these figures. I should tell you, I will end on a positive note, but I should also just give you the information. Scientists agree that this is really a huge challenge for societies to try to reduce these emissions. This is another figure I included because I think this Global Carbon Project has such a great tool of looking at the different data. It's interesting because we have here, it's a time, it's an evolution over the time of the emissions. So we are here in 1990 and the latest data are from 2018. 1990 is an interesting year because scientists tend to say that this is the year in which nobody could no longer deny that the new climate change was caused by human beings. It's generally seen that well, there were actually already studies showing this much earlier, but in 1990, it's always used as a kind of a benchmark for one could no longer say that one didn't know about this. And when I say one, I mean, of course, policymakers and those who have responsible positions in society. So let's start from the top and move to the bottom. Here at this side, we have the same figures that we had in the previous table, which is tons CO2 equivalent, hence greenhouse gas emissions per person. The blue line is the United States of America. They were at 1990 around 20 ton, and then it went up. And now it's going down, but I think as you can see for all these graphs, it's not as if they're all dramatically going down. It's more like there's some movement, but this one is actually, if there is somebody who has expertise on this in the virtual room, they may comment on this later on. This is Saudi Arabia. It has a lot of fluctuation, and there must be some local circumstances due to this that I do not know. The green line is the Russian Federation. So, of course, around 1990, there was the former Soviet Union was dissolved into different nation states with all the economic, political, and social changes. But we have seen then that it's basically slightly going up from between 7.5 and 10, and now at the end slightly going down. And then EU 27 is the next line. Well, it's going down a tiny little bit here. One sees it starting to go down. But it basically means that between 1990 and 2018, which is 18 years, no, it's not 18 years, it's 28 years, it has gone down from 10 tons to just above 7.5. And this then, of course, shows again the great global inequalities. This is China, where, of course, we see it going up. with China, the Chinese economy, growing and becoming very expansive, we see that this goes up. And of course, because China, this is per capita, but because China is a country with a very large population, this of course has a huge effect on the atmosphere. And this is India, where you just see it's going up slightly, but it is still very low compared with all the other countries. And the reason why these data are important is, of course, from an ethical perspective, from a normative perspective, we can ask, well, why should some countries, such as the European Union countries, or a fortiori the United States, who have already made so many emissions for so many years, how should we divide this budget? That's now the question. How should we divide the budget that is remaining? And there are, of course, voices who say, well, let those countries, such as India and Brazil and African countries that are still at very low level of emissions, that will be at the receiving end disproportionately of the consequences of climate change, let them have either the emissions or let us provide them the free technology transfer to be able to develop their economies in a carbon neutral way. But it's obvious that these data raise serious normative, ethical, but also, of course, political questions. Now I want to stop with talking about the data and talk about the kind of questions and the kind of issues this raises. What kind of problem is climate change or carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions? Often, if you look at the debates among politicians and in the newspapers, it's often phrased as a question about innovation or technological development. For example, debates about geoengineering. It's also often argued to be an economic question. So, for example, in debates about whether what kind of changes are needed, often arguments by people who want to not make huge changes to the economy, they say, well, no, because there will be job losses, and they have all sorts of economic arguments. So economic concerns are very central. There are, of course, also a lot of motivational questions. There are questions like, well, this is such a huge challenge. Why should people as individual citizens be motivated to do this? Because, well, they can't help it. We're all powerless individuals. There are, of course, also questions of power and prevailing interests. And I think my sense is that we are actually seeing more of this in the last couple of years. So one area in which this has shown itself is all the legal cases that have been raised against both governments, for example, in the Netherlands, but also now increasingly against, for example, the fossil fuel industry companies, where citizens, organizations try to use legal resources to force governments or fossil fuel industry companies to reduce their emissions. And there you just see that it's, and you see that it's a really trying to gain power over what will happen. And another area in which we see this is civil disobedient protests. So the famous example is, of course, Greta Thunberg, who is trying to mobilize citizens. But another example is the organization, well, I don't know whether I should say organization, the network called Extinction Rebellion, who want, in a non-violent way, protest the actions of countries that are, of the governments in countries that are polluting a lot, and also actually of the companies that are polluting a lot. Then there's, of course, questions of governance and politics. Even if one has those goals of reducing, even if one commits, not just on paper, but generally commits to, say, the Paris Agreement, how then to do this? And there you can also see that some people, that could be academics or politicians or citizens, who subscribe to the same goals, say 1.5 degrees reduction, disagree a lot about the means. And a good example here is nuclear energy. So among all those who think that climate change is a serious problem and that it should be addressed in a very forceful way, There are those who think that nuclear energy is absolutely necessary, and there are those who think that nuclear energy, investing in it and increasing our capacity is a red herring and should be avoided. So this is also one question. What the point that I want to make is that it is actually also a moral question. Why? Because it concerns moral principles and values. I have already mentioned some of this when I was looking at the inequalities in the emissions, but there are a few further principles. And in ethics, which is the science of moral questions, there are different ways to look at the question, when is something a moral issue? A very long-standing and canonical principle is the harm principle, which was proposed by the classical liberal thinker John Stuart Mill let me just look on my paper, in 1859. So he's become famous for the harm principle. And the harm principle goes as follows: one is not warranted, either individually or collectively, to interfere in the liberty of others except when harm is at stake. The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of the community is to prevent harm being done to others. And so one of the arguments that climate ethicists are making is that in a certain sense, by disproportionately emitting, one is harming others. And the others could then be people living in fragile circumstances, so like the people living on the islands in the Pacific, or it could be people living in the future, but they use the concept of harm. Another way to look at this is by looking at human rights. Human rights is a discourse, a theory that is both in philosophy, but also, of course, as we know, in legal scholarship. And this, I think, makes human rights quite powerful because the moral arguments have a legal backup, so to say. And there are philosophers such as Simon Caney from the University of Warwick in the UK, who argue that climate change is violating the human rights of certain people who are living now, say people who live in areas where there will be an increase in famines, and especially people who will be living in the future. And then a third way to look at it, which I tend to use from my background as somebody who's interested in questions of distributive justice, is to look at it as a question of how do we make a fair division of a common resource that is scarce. And then the resource is, I'll try to formulate it as precisely as possible. The resource is the capacity of the atmosphere to absorb greenhouse gas emissions. That capacity is limited, it's scarce. Everybody wants to have it because everybody wants to do these things, consumption, etc., that require the emissions. And then the question is, how do you make a fair division? So that is why this raises moral questions. One interesting perspective on this issue came from the Canadian philosopher Stephen Gardiner, who called climate change a perfect moral storm. And here he says, a perfect storm is an event constituted by an unusual convergence of independently harmful factors, where this convergence is likely to result in substantial and possibly catastrophic negative outcomes. So it's really different things that come together and then it becomes multiplied. And he believes that climate change is such a perfect moral storm, not just a storm, but also a moral storm, because it threatens our ability to behave morally. Now, what does he mean with this? Let me just first very briefly say why he thinks it's a global storm, an intertemporal storm, and a theoretical storm. He thinks it's a global storm because there are three difficult issues that in themselves are already problematic, but because they come together, become amplified. The first one is that in the case of climate change, there is a dispersion between causes and effects. Well, a good example is what we've seen in the data. Say, citizens in the USA cause a lot of emissions, And citizens in Kiribati who emit less than 1 ton a year, they actually see their livelihoods threatened and eventually destroyed, and also their nations destroyed. And why is this? Because climate change as a geophysical process is a global process. So the people who live, say, somewhere in the US or somewhere in Europe, they, of course, do not intend, or they do not see that what they are doing causes these effects eventually somewhere else. But there is a second element, which is that agency, which is the capacity to act, is also fragmented. So it's both in what we do, because we all make a tiny, tiny contribution, but also in our capacity to solve this. So people feel powerless in addressing this. And then the final problem is that there is an institutional inadequacy. Normally, if you have a problem in a country and you have a well-functioning government, which is, of course, something that I think we can nowhere just assume, but at least you can hope that the government does what the citizens want it to do, then you can have institutional solutions to problems, because we can vote for laws, and then the laws are implemented and you can find a solution. But the problem, of course, is what can the citizens of the islands in the Pacific do about the fact that in other countries there is so much pollution? They can do nothing. And the reason is, of course, because there is no world government. I am not at all saying we should have a world government. I'm just saying that if the problem is global, but you do not have a way to have institutional design at that level in an effective way, because we also know there's a United Nations, but it is weak in many different ways, that this causes problems. And a good illustration is how long it has taken nations to come to some agreements about climate that were at least minimally effective. And even the climate scientists, when there was the Paris Agreement and the politicians were very happy, the climate scientists said, well, they were just happy there was an agreement. But many of them just said, well, this is still not powerful enough. And this storm that we have globally, we also have intertemporally, because of course because the emissions are in the atmosphere for hundreds and hundreds of years, it is people who will live in the future who will bear the negative consequences more than us. Actually, many of the people who are now in the driving seat of being able to make decisions, they will no longer be living when the most negative consequences will be affected. And then a final storm is what Gardner calls theoretical storm, that our theories are not very well suited to deal with the many problems characteristic of the long-term future. And with this, he refers to the fact that, for example, many of our theories assume that with, say, representative democracies, we can make collective decisions. But representative democracies means that all the adults that are citizens in a country can vote. Children cannot vote. Animals cannot vote. But also people who are outside that country that are affected by the policies in that country cannot vote. And also, of course, all the people who will live in the future cannot vote. So there are problems with the way we think about the long term that we have not incorporated in the way we make theories about how to govern the earth. And there are, of course, also not only philosophers, but also other theories who say that all our theorizing is deeply anthropocentric. So eventually we only think about human beings. We do not think about animals, and we do not think about ecosystems. They are only instrumentally important to the rights and well-beings of human beings. And they say that in itself is also a moral issue. Okay, so now Gardner says that this, and I see that I need to kind of wrap up, so I'll go a bit faster through the next slides. There's only 3 more. Gardner says that these problems that I just addressed lead to what he calls moral corruption, that we cannot ethically act. Why? because there are psychological mechanisms that are facilitated by this storm that allow us to not do what we should do. And he speaks of things such as we try to distract ourselves from the problem, we show complacency, we raise unreasonable doubts about all sorts of things, we devote our attention selectively to those things that should not receive the attention, we are self-delusional, we are trying to pandering, and we are also engaging in hypocritical reasoning. So he thinks that the situation I just described with the 3 global storms enable all these mechanisms and mean that that there is a serious risk of moral corruption. But now comes the good news: there are solutions. So far, I hope you can forgive me for not being very optimistic or happy story. But the good news is that the scientists say that fast and deep, that should be decarbonization. Fast and deep decarbonization is possible. We are able to solve this problem technically, in the sense that it is possible, but it requires us to move fast, effectively, and to act. So we should make far-reaching changes to how we currently live, how we produce, how we consume, how we move around, what we do with land, which technologies we develop, etc. So it really requires leadership. Now, I will not talk about all these different solutions. I just want to mention one very accessible website called Drawdown, which has a list. Originally, it was a book. This book, which was published in 2017, which had solutions. The book basically says, here's a list of solutions. If we implement all of this, we can reverse the situation. And there's now a revised version that is open access on the website. But you can also see that the solutions are, of course, also sometimes country specific. What then, if there are solutions, but we have all these moral issues, then what does this imply for duties? And this is, of course, a central concept in moral theory. So if the current level and the distributions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions are a moral issue, then this entails duties. We should respect human rights, we should not do harm, we should not take more than our fair share. That's the ways in which we could look at this. But the question is, and of course then, I should also say that philosophers then endlessly debate, for example, how to exactly determine what one's fair share is. Economists also take part in these discussions. I'm not going there today. I'm just assuming that we can somehow reasonably decide what, at least within boundaries, what a fair share is. But the question then is, if these are duties, to respect these human rights, to not do harm, to not take more than your fair share of emissions, what kind of duties are these? Are these individuals or are these collective duties? And here you see that climate ethicists disagree. But I think there has been a lot of debate about this over recent years. And what I will present you is what I think is it's at least the version, the answer that I think is strongest and that I would also defend. But it's not, I think, an eccentric view. I think morally, if you speak only morally and you don't think about implementation, you can say that these duties are individual. So you can say, yes, we should not take more than our fair share of these emissions. But the thing is that we are also, as individual persons, living in societies, and we cannot change societies by ourselves. So the solutions must be structural. The solutions to do it fast and deep, the decarbonization, are structural. So that means that it must be governments and NGOs and other forms that really make the changes. But then if that is true, then the question is, what then are the roles and the duties for individuals? Now, I think I would say the following. I think as individuals, we have different roles. And one of our role is as a citizen. And as citizens, we can take political actions. So you can enforce structural changes. You can demand them from the people for whom you voted. You can, of course, vote for parties who take climate change seriously. You can support activist groups. For example, in the Netherlands, just to give just one example, but there are many, many, many examples. There is, you can buy for 23 euros, you can buy one share, Shell, of company Shell. And then there is a businessman who represents all these shareholders. And every time there is a meeting of the shareholders of Shell, he will put forward a proposal to make Shell move more towards renewable energies. So this is what one calls shareholder activism. So this is one way in which citizens could do something and take up their duties. That is, as I think, as citizens, as political actors. And then you have, of course, citizens as consumers. Well, we can all think about lifestyle changes. That's what some people say we should do. Some people say we should all become vegan or vegetarian, but there are, of course, for those who are currently eating meat, less drastic way to make lifestyle changes. But we can also invest in renewable energies by joining cooperatives or just putting solar panels on our roof, etc. There are many, many different options. But we also have roles as professionals. So one thing is if you are a climate scientist, I think you can play a role by doing science public talks and talking about battling climate denialists. That's basically what I wrote there. You can also enhance the public debate. If you are a technology developer, you can use your skills to develop the technologies and so on. And then the final role is, which I think is really overlooked, is governments are not monolithic blocks. Governments, in the end, also consist of individuals, and the same for political parties. And I think they could also resist pressure from the status quo interest groups, because they are unfortunately sometimes very vulnerable to lobbying, but even corruptive forces. And in that way, they could help to proceed to fast and deep carbonization. My time is up, so I will give you the last slide. There are complications, and I'm happy to talk with you about them when we have the discussion in a minute. I'll just mention a few. One is, I've already mentioned that there really is a problem about how to solve a collective action problem if there is no world government. This is a challenge, but it's not unsurmountable. Another question that is raised is about democracy and climate justice. These are, in ethics and political philosophy, both considered important values. Democracy is important because it takes each person serious as a political equal, and climate justice is important for all the reasons I've given you. But democracy as we know it, which means, as I just explained, representative democracy for those who currently are alive and are adults, means that many people tend to vote for their own interest. Not everybody, many people vote for their own interest. But climate justice requires us to look in the long run. So how can this tension be solved? And there are now people, scholars, thinking about ways in which we can protect the fundamental interest of those who will live in the future in our democratic deliberations. For example, by having an ombudsperson for future generations check all the laws that are being proposed by Parliament. The third complication is, of course, motivational problems. I am not a specialist on this, but I know that there are people who study climate psychology, and I think it is really a serious challenge. And then I want to end on a somewhat a more optimistic note, which is, it is really important for us to keep hope. Hope is crucial, and hope should not be confused with optimism. Optimism is when one tries to think that things will be fine, and that means we can just sit back and relax. I do not think we have reasons for optimism, but we do have reasons for hope every time somebody takes up one of those possibilities for making a change, because in the end, all the small changes, the ones I just mentioned, of taking up a duty to do something in one of the roles that you can have as a citizen or a professional or as a politician, together they can make a change. And I think as long as the Earth system scholars and the climate scientists say it is possible, we should, also actually as a sort of a moral duty, keep up hope and have the kind of conversations that I hope we will now have. And I thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Robijns. Ingrid, I think I can call you Ingrid. Thank you. I'll switch to a different modus so people can see us. Thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. I don't know if you, if the last line of hope counters all the other slides and stories that you told us. There are a lot of questions. Some of them are technical, some of them are less technical, more philosophical. And I wanted to start with one that was raised by Alisa Medvedeva, who said, "I wonder how much CO2 we produce by just breathing. That's also something we can't cut down to zero, like eating." And I would like to add, I have also people in my surroundings that say having children is also a big. So, what is your look upon that? Because we face a huge problem. Yeah.
Yeah. So yes. Well, actually, a couple of years ago, I organized a scholarly workshop with demographers and ethicists to talk about the population question in climate science, because there are, of course, people who say all these other things are not important. Really, population is the big issue. Of course, what we know is that population increases right now are in the areas in the world in which the average emissions are very low. Africa is the continent that still has population increases and also fertility rates that are higher than replacement rates, but they have such low levels of consumption that there is also something quite cynical about telling those people, well, you should not you should do something about population growth because of the climate problem, whereas they have not caused the climate problem. And of course, we also know from history that there are worries about racist undertones in that kind of discourse. However, what I should also say, because I actually think this is a complicated issue, and I try to avoid the mud throwing that happens in a lot of these debates. In this book that I mentioned, the Drawdown, there are, if you look also on the website, the most effective measures, two of them, if you combine them, they are by far the most effective, and that is empowering girls and women and providing them with the kind of birth control mechanisms that they want. So there is, of course, there is in scientific grounds, there is a relation between the two. But I think the case for providing girls and women education, effective access to contraceptives, access to jobs, we have very strong independent reasons, nothing to do with climate, why we should give that to them. So I actually think it's much more fruitful to just say women are human beings equally on a par with men. They should not be second-rate citizens. They should be able to control their fertility. That's, of course, a very sensitive issue in some both patriarchal and also in some sense homogenic religious countries. But if you take that line, you do not need to have play the climate card for reducing population. And then the question that we all breed, yes. So I do think that is also why we do, the climate is there not for itself. The climate is there to support human beings, animals, nature. So in the end, so there are also people, philosophers, who are what we call antinatalists. They say it would be best if all of us would be dead. I think that is a very sad story. I'm happy to be alive, and I think people should have flourishing lives. But we should just find a way to do it in such a way that others will not suffer. Yeah, and that we breed, well, let's just enjoy our breeding.
But I just shared the link actually with drawdown solutions, health and education, where indeed it said that empowering women and education is very important, and it's a very helpful website indeed. You also mentioned that one of the many ways where we can try to influence is by using our right to vote, vote for parties, political parties that take climate change seriously. But what is holding, you think, leaders back? World leaders into seriously, it seems, tackling these problems?
So I think so. The answer I should give is you should ask a political scientist. But I will give you my what I know from, because of course I read in all across the social sciences. I think there are. I do think, unfortunately, the answer is a bit cynical about politicians, and that is, we know from public choice theory that politicians are there also. They try to have elections in such a way that they can maximize or protect their own interests, and these interests can be staying in power or other types of interests, and that means that most of the time they are there for the short run. They take decisions with the short run, and that often means the next election in sight. And this might be a reason why we need a different type. We need a kind of in order to protect the interests of people who live in the future, we might need to have a kind of a security on the democratic system. So, for example, most countries have constitutions. Well, I think almost all countries or all countries have constitutions. And one of the roles of constitutions is to protect interests that should not be that politicians should not be able to overrule, like in a fad or in a fashion. And one argument, for example, that has been made in the climate ethics literature is that the right to a livable earth should be in the constitution, and that then the government would be, for example, by way of the constitutional court, they would be limited in doing actions that would not violate that right. So that could be a way to tame politicians, if you want. But I do think that in the end, if and there's also a lot of literature on this in political philosophy, that if politicians do things that really harm citizens' interests, then the argument in philosophy goes that you then have a moral right to civic disobedience.
No.
So I think, if I look at this professionally, I do think that groups such as Extinction Rebellion are morally entitled in doing what they do. Yeah. That is
Connect. No, I see what you mean, but it's a very difficult, of course, question, because you might argue that some countries where there's larger emission. I mean, all countries will take this stance differently. Yeah, how much they pollute, how much they can change also the way they pollute. And Stefan asked a question. Suggesting, could there be international treaties, for example, by the UN, who you mentioned is in many ways also a weak organization, but could they enforce? Would you see that happening? Enforce some kind of these rules on countries that do not want to comply?
Yeah, I really don't know. So I know that there are people in law who specialize in this kind of, but I just don't know. But what I found really fascinating is that to see the number of climate litigation that is currently happening. This is quite remarkable because and you see one group. So I think one of the first, not necessarily the first, but one of the first was in the Netherlands, Urgenda, which is I don't know whether I should call it an NGO or a network organization. And they brought together a group of citizens who went to court against the Dutch state to force them to stick to their own promises about reduction. But the thing is, they went to court. They were given what they demanded. Then there was an appeal, and then another appeal. In the end, at the highest level, the government has to do what they. So Urgenda was given the right. Was said, yes, you're right. The government should do this. But the last thing I read is that, there has been a legal procedure. The government doesn't do it. So what? they will
Yeah.
be fined. But you know, the problem is, of course, that fines and it doesn't help climate. The climate is a geophysical system. So it really, all the talking and all the lawsuits are, of course, having in themselves no effects on the climate. The only thing that it's a physical process. We just need to cut the emissions, and if we can't cut them, we have to suck them from the atmosphere and store them somewhere,
Yeah.
or we have to go for geoengineering, which is, of course, very tricky because we don't know what the effects would be. So
Yeah.
geoengineering, in case you don't know, is just where we would do things like solar radiation management, where we would put, say, sulfur or something like that in the atmosphere, so that the heat from the solar would be less when it touches the earth, and then there would be less temperature increase. But of course, this is also, for example, a very interesting thing from a global perspective, because some countries are now thinking they should experiment with it, but we do not have a global system to
No.
deliberate on this.
No, and you don't know what, I mean, one country can put it in the air, but what happens to neighboring countries? I mean, it's yeah. Connected. This is of course a challenge that we meet. Raisa asks another challenge that affects individual duties is manufactured content by companies or other bodies that spread climate denialism in various ways. And how is this issue talked about in the context of moral studies, and how this affects the individual duties?
Yes, that's a very good question. So there are so in philosophy, it's basically people who work in epistemology who write about this. They talk about, it's in the area of conspiracy theories, etc., where these kind of issues are discussed, which is not my area of specialization. So when we in ethics work write on this, we mostly say, okay, this is well, it's we think if the people who do this climate denialism, if they really know that they're spreading lies, that is just very easily to argue that it's immoral, because it's a moral, you're doing something immoral if you lie and you know this will harm others. But and one could say that perhaps some of them are disillusioned and they are for whatever reason. But there are scholars such as Naomi Oreskes from Harvard who have also studied precisely how these processes happen, and it is really quite. It's not. There is a lot of organization behind this. So it really, if you read that kind of scholarship, that kind of research, it really makes you think, makes you more pessimistic, because you just see there's lots of evil forces. And of course, that is also a question about how do you see the population? Do you think everybody is well-meaning, or do you think, well, there's lots of evil forces? And I do think that it is. Yeah, that's a tough one. But I think in terms of the duties, so the second part of the question was, what are the duties? I think if you suppose you are at a birthday party, well, in Corona times, this is hard to imagine, but imagine we're going to be post-pandemic or pre-pandemic, and we have a birthday party. And somebody just says something that you know from popular science you've read that is really, really a lie. Then what do? Do you just stay silent, or do you try to correct the wrong belief of this person? And I do think we do have moral duties to try to say something. But what is tricky is one should try to do it in a way that is effective. And in order to know what is effective, well, you need to know the person, or you need to know a bit about psychology. And that is, of course, difficult. So sometimes, I guess, just asking a question could be a way to start raising some doubts about a wrong belief. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it is difficult, and also very, I think, now in this current crisis of Corona, we could have similar conversations, of course, about another.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's And this is again a challenge. I thought an interesting question because I remember this happening in Texas, Houston, Texas. A question from Andre, who's a biologist at the University of Texas. And maybe you remember it also, Ingrid. Some time ago, there was a horrible freeze last winter, and the wind generator stopped working, and several million people were without electricity for many days. And now a lot of people there are against wind power. Now, what would you say to these people, and how would you motivate them?
Yeah.
And as climate changes, there will be more instability. So there's also no linear
Yeah, yeah,
road towards
yeah.
this reduction.
So, Andre, I should say I'm of course not an energy specialist, but I sometimes follow these debates, so I'll just tell you what I understand is that that the people who are at the front line of making this energy transition say that it's crucial to take the citizens along. So that it's really crucial to do things in conversation with citizens, to not do things top down, because then I don't know how this happened in Texas where they had this who was involved in this. But for example, um, we know that there's because windmills, there is of course even in countries where we do not have a risk of a horrible freeze with moderate climates. Many people are against windmills because of the visual effects of that it will destroy the landscape that they can look at. And one way people try to solve this or address this is by doing two things. One is, uh, of course, really try to talk with local people and give them different scenarios and debate them, but also give them an option of putting some of their savings, if they have savings, but if they have savings, to put them in that cooperative. And I don't know how it's currently in the US, but in the Netherlands, if you have a saving account, there the interest rate is lower than inflation. So there's no point in having savings in your bank account. And if I understand the economists, they say this might be for a very long time. Whereas, of course, the financial return from investing in energy is quite high. And this could be one way in which you could try also to take people along. That's one answer. The other answer is also that I do think that those who argue for nuclear energy, that's one argument some of them make. They say you have to have an energy mix. So one thing could also be you might have to keep having some carbon fuel generated electricity, but just try to minimize it. So that is one possible strategy to try to have the instability in the energy supply of the renewable energy to try to counter this instability by possibly still having some nuclear energy, or of course, we are hoping that the batteries for renewable energy will be developed fast, and then still having some carbon energy. But of course, if that's what we want to do for the long run, it gives us all the more reason to kind of save a bit from our carbon budget for when we will basically have made this transition.
Yeah.
But these are challenging issues, and I think it illustrates how big the challenge is, and that we should.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No, and I'm reading some of the comments of the attendees. I think I would advise them indeed to also look at drawdown.org for the solutions. But before I go to the last question, I would final before last question. It was actually on the carbon counter that you showed us in the beginning. And actually, people are interested. Is this updated also with in terms of regulation on emissions? Can it go slower? Can it go back?
I
With
don't know. I
no,
don't know. So I'll tell you how I do this, because as I said, I'm not a scientist.
no, yeah,
I use sources. I always ask my friends in the geo department, is this a reliable source, or they just tell me do this, do that, and
yeah,
yeah. And in the end, of course, science is also a system of trust, but it has a lot of checks and balances. And I'm just fortunate that Utrecht University has one of the best team. There's a big team working on climate issues, and scientists, I mean. So you could just, and I'm sure you can find it, or drop an email to the people who've put it online.
Yeah.
I should also say that so for example, I mentioned this table that I made was from the 2018 data. I earlier used estimates that Lucas Chancel and Thomas Piketty made. They are a bit different, but of course, the small differences may be relevant for if you want to get really into the details of the statistics. But for the moral questions, it actually doesn't make a difference.
No.
It's really
No.
about the size of the problem and the size of the inequalities and the
Yeah.
size of how much time we still have.
Then my last question, and attendees, the presentation will be sent to you, by the way. Ingrid has been so kind to allow this. In your personal life, what does it have an effect on you? You do all the research, so how do you?
Yeah. I'll just give you an honest answer. I'll tell you
Please.
what I did, and I'll tell you what I struggle with. So one of the things we did is my husband and I bought a house 12, 13 years ago. And when we bought it, we put solar panels on the roof. We were the first to do it in the street. It was not subsidized, and we just thought, okay, we're just going to put our savings in this thing. And that, of course, that means we produce, I don't know how much, but about 60%, I think, of our electricity we produce ourselves. And what we did with another thing we did was we saved for a long time for when our car would break down. Actually, of course, we are lucky that in the Netherlands you don't need a car for a lot of things. You can, if you live in the city, you can use a bike. But when we saved for when we eventually had to replace our car, we were first thinking we go to car sharing. And I should say that Corona made me revisit this. So this is a sad thing, but I just thought a year ago our car broke down. We had to decide what to do. And then we decided, okay, we are going to buy an electric car. We thought this is unaffordable. This is too expensive. But the funny thing is, and that's why I'm also glad I have a background in economics. The difference is you have to have savings. But then, if we were putting fuel in our car, we often had almost 100 euros. If we load the battery of our car, we have like 7 or 10 euros. Yeah. So that means for the economists in the room that the fixed costs are very big at the start, or you would have to take a loan, but that the marginal costs are very small. And that, I think, makes a difference. And also we are flexitarians. We are not vegetarians, but we don't eat a lot of meat. Yeah. The difficult bit for me is flying for work. And I just find it difficult because, I mean, people invite me to go somewhere, so I think I can do something for them. But then, so this is a difficult thing. Yeah. But on the good news is that within in the western side of Europe, they have reinstalled night trains. For example, in September, I need to go to Vienna, and I checked it, and going by train is 1/4, 25% of the emissions by going by plane. So I'm thinking to go by. Yeah. Yeah. So these are the kind of considerations you can make. Yeah. Yeah. But this is not going to save the world. It has to be political pressure.
Yeah. So it's small steps that we need to make by ourselves and use our right to influence politics as much as we can. Yeah.
That's a good summary.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Robijns. Thank you, Ingrid. And I know that questions. Yeah, it's a good. Okay, so there are still questions here, and I think people could look them up at Drawdown. But there's someone who wants to hear your opinion. So I don't know if you see it also. If the production of artificial production of meat. So if we stop killing animals for meat, but we use artificial meat, and it's.
But, these are factual questions. I'm a philosopher. Of course, I read a lot in the social science and economics. But and I believe there must be answers to this on internet. Yeah. But of course, Jekke, you could invite The
Yeah,
Netherlands.
yeah. No, but we have done that, and we get to say. So it's very interesting to see these discussions, and I'm very happy, attendees, that you're here with us and posing these questions. And I think we have to tackle it all together. We'll be back with more lectures on similar topics, and actually, at a certain moment post-corona, we hope to invite people like you, Professor Robijns, to also discuss it in person with your fellow professors in Russia and with colleagues. We came to the end of this lecture, not ended, of course, with questions, but I think it's very important that we have it all in our mind that we have to make a difference. If you believe that climate change is there, and well, I believe it, and I think Ingrid believes it, and I think many of the attendees believe it. So thank you, Ingrid. Thank you, dear attendees. Looking forward to next lectures, and yeah, wishing you all a very nice evening, but also a wonderful summer. Stay healthy, and hope to see you back.
Thank you all.